Let's compare learning to how a satellite dish works. A satellite dish is a type of antenna that uses a parabolic dish to capture and reflect signals from orbiting satellites onto a receiver called a feed horn. The satellite dish receives signals from satellites that orbit the Earth. The satellite sends a signal to the satellite where it can be used to watch TV. In order for the satellite dish to work, it needs to be pointed directly at the satellite without anything getting in the way of the signal. Now let's compare how learning is like a satellite dish. We'll start with learning strategies or learning skills. Learning strategies are the things that you can do to enhance or facilitate your learning. They involve skills such as distributed learning, metacognition, active learning, creating clues, and many others. In our analogy, they are the support structures holding up the dish and the feed horn. Knowledge is the stuff that you know about. It's stored in your long-term memory. And in our analogy, your knowledge is represented by the satellite dish. Now, unfortunately, we don't know everything. We'll always have gaps in our understanding. When you try to learn something new for the first time, it's like the signal is passing through a hole in your knowledge or your dish. There's nothing to catch it and reflect it back to your working memory. This is where learning skills come to play. When you identify a gap in your knowledge, you can use your learning skills to help close the gap. Let's take a closer look. First, notice how much smaller the feed horn is compared to the dish. It's the same way in our brains. We can store lots of information in our long-term memory, but we can only think about a few things at a time in our short-term memory. Scientists estimate that we can only work with about 7 things at a time. When something is going over our head or passing through our dish, we can use some of our short-term memory to look up information about it to help reflect that knowledge back to our working memory. The downside is that it uses up part of your working memory to find the missing information, leaving you with less cognitive power to understand what you are learning. For example, if you were reading this text but did not know the words satellite, antenna, parabolic, capture, reflect, orbiting, or receiver, your experience would look something like this. A dish is a type of that uses a dish to and signals from onto called a feed horn as shown below. The feed horn then sends the signal to where it can be used to watch TV. For the dish to work, it needs to be pointed directly at without anything getting in the way of the signal. You can see that every time that you look up a word, it's going to take more active memory. Pretty soon you won't have enough memory left to understand what you're reading. If you feel like your dish has a lot of holes, don't get discouraged. Everyone has gaps in their understanding. But by using effective learning strategies, you can fill in your knowledge gaps. For example, a reading strategy like previewing, where you read headlines, look for images, or anything else that might capture your attention, you start to piece together what the text is going to be about before you start reading. This uses your brain's natural ability to start making connections to things that you already know. In fact, your brain is basically an association machine. It's constantly looking for connections and trying to make predictions. It does this by forming neural pathways between different parts of your brain and connecting them to things that you already know about. For example, let's say you're reading about the War of 1812, but nothing seems to be sticking. It's just going through a gap in your knowledge. But you take a moment and you step back and you preview the text and you notice that the war was between the United States and Great Britain. Well, your brain starts to associate those two countries with the American Revolutionary War and 1776, and then you notice a bit about the French Revolution and Napoleon. And that starts your brain thinking about all the things you might know about Napoleon, including if you saw the movie Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. Well, you keep previewing and you see names like Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, you see Napoleon, but you also see Native Americans and the Shawnee. And now your mind's thinking about, wait, Now the Native Americans are also involved. As you start to trigger all of your prior knowledge, questions start to form in your mind like, why did America and Britain go back to war? And how were Native Americans involved? Who won the war? How did any of this shape my life today? As all this activity starts to flare up in your mind, neural pathways start to form, and you make connections to your prior knowledge. As that happens, you're better able to comprehend your reading, and the gap in your knowledge of the War of 1812, starts to shrink. Your brain is so good at making these associations that if you happen to be listening to Beethoven while you were studying, it will also start to make a connection to the War of 1812 and Beethoven. And the next time you're listening to Beethoven or thinking about Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, it could re-trigger that neural pathway that you created about the War of 1812. The more you trigger the neural pathways in your brain, the stronger they get, and the easier it is for you to remember them. In effect, when you're learning, you're literally wiring your brain or rewiring your brain to learn and to think differently. Now, why is all this important? Let's return to our analogy of the satellite dish. Let's say that something triggered the memory of the war in 1812. Because of the neural pathways you've created, you don't just get the memory of the War of 1812, you get everything that's connected to that in your neural pathway. And those are reflected back into your active memory, allowing you to have more insights and gain more knowledge. That's why prior knowledge is such a strong predictor of student success. Now, let's take a gospel take on this. God has commanded us to learn of things in heaven and in earth and under the earth, and things which have been, things which are, things which must shortly come to pass, things which are at home, things which are abroad, the wars and perplexities of nations, and of the judgments which are upon the land, and a knowledge also of countries and of kingdoms. Now, why would he want us to know so many different things? Well, he answers that in the next verse when he says, that ye may be prepared in all things, when I shall send you again to magnify the calling whereunto I have called you, and the mission with which I have commissioned you. Now, imagine that you've studied all these things and that they're in your long-term memory or on your dish. The more you know, the better the Holy Ghost is able to illuminate your intellect and teach you things and bring all things unto remembrance. This is why when you're under the influence of the Holy Ghost, it can feel like a rush of information and ideas, because it's reflecting your prior understanding, your prior knowledge, and everything that you've come to know back to you. That's one of the reasons why the Holy Ghost and its promptings can feel so familiar. It's also why we learn line upon line and precept upon precept, because as our knowledge grows, we gain the ability to understand more than we previously did. Now let's step back and take a look at our analogy. First, learning strategies support and enhance your ability to learn. They are like the support structures holding up the dish and the feed horn and making sure that it's pointed at the satellite so that you can receive a signal. The dish represents our knowledge or the things that we already know. Neural pathways are the connections our mind creates between the things that we know. The more that we trigger or practice something over and over, the neural pathways in our brains grow and strengthen. This makes it easier to recall. It's also how habits are formed and how we also form the way that we think. All of this comes together as we learn because as our prior knowledge amplifies our ability to learn new things by increasing the amount of information we have to reflect back onto our working memory. Like all analogies, this one isn't perfect, but hopefully it helps you understand how learning strategies, prior knowledge, and developing our neural pathways can increase our ability to learn.